To be irrational or illogical is to abandon what Scripture says about making or taking every thought captive to obey Christ. It says that in 2 Corinthians 10:5. And that means that it's also to be in sin if you are not thinking properly, if you're not submitting your thoughts to Christ, then we're in sin. We're thinking with a sinful mind. It could also be said that God's thoughts, or that we are thinking God's thoughts after him. And that was coined by the astronomer and mathematician Johannes Kepler. He literally said, I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him, which expressed the idea that his scientific work was pointing to God's rational character and creation. Hey, welcome back to Campfire Apologetics, where I help equip the everyday Christian with tools to help defend their faith in an increasingly hostile culture. I'm your host, Mark Hudson. I did a previous episode on what is known as the Euthyphro Dilemma. And in that episode, I explained why and how the dilemma was, one, not actually a dilemma, and two, how it committed a fallacy known as the bifurcation fallacy. And in that episode, I gave a few examples of common fallacies that I typically come across, me personally. And you can share after this video, once I've gotten through all these different fallacies. If there's any that I didn't mention that you can think of, maybe leave a comment with some that you come across, that you think are common. But these are the ones that I typically come across. And I mentioned in the Euthyphro Dilemma video that I mentioned that I would have a later episode that got a bit more in depth with some fallacies. And so here we are. That's this episode. And I would like to do that here, along with talking about the 3 laws of logic. Now, I want to talk about the 3 laws of logic because I think they go hand in hand with understanding fallacies. Typically someone is introduced to fallacies when they study logic. So I thought it would be appropriate to couple these things together. And again, real quick, if you like this kind of content, if you like the stuff that I'm doing, the things that I cover, if you like apologetics, or you've just been, blessed by any one of my videos or anything that I have said, leave a comment or subscribe, or do both, because it helps these social media algorithms and being able to get this content out to more people. So go ahead and help me out by doing that. But so anyway, I personally think that the study of logic is extremely important when it comes to doing apologetics. Just as apologetics is necessary for evangelism, rational thinking is necessary for apologetics. And why is it important, though? It's because we serve a logical and reasonable God. Logic and reason are part of God's character. And so thinking rationally is our best attempt to think like God. Like I've said many times before, I'm not an expert. I'm not a scholar on this issue or any other, but I have spent quite a bit of time studying these things and just studying apologetics, studying the things that I make videos on. I do research, and I have studied quite a bit of these things for quite some time. So I just have a passion for it. But understanding logic, getting back into it, and fallacies is extremely helpful when having conversations with unbelievers, because it allows you to pick out flawed thinking and inconsistencies in the points or objections that they're making. This takes time and practice, though. It's one of those things. It's the more you expose yourself to it, to these ideas, then the more they're going to jump out to you in conversation, and the easier they're going to be to recognize, the easier they're going to be to understand. Don't be like me, where you don't have any patience and you expect to just study something or read something and just grasp it right then and there. That's just not, it's not how things work. And I oftentimes get frustrated with myself because I think that I should be able to just pick things up like that. Like I live in the Matrix and I can just download information. But that's not how it goes. And the older I get, the harder it is to retain information, it seems. But Again, this is something that I'm still working on. I'm not a master of logic and fallacies. There's a lot of times where I might hear someone make a point or an assertion, and I think to myself that I know something's off about what they're saying. Something's not quite right, but sometimes in the moment I can't quite figure it out. I'll be thinking like, okay, what are they saying? What fallacy are they committing? Like, what is the flaw in their logic? And I know it's there. I can't quite figure it out, exactly what it is. And then of course it'll come to me at 3 in the morning. I'll wake up out of a dead sleep and think, oh, it was the bifurcation fallacy or whatever. And of course, I'm nowhere near the person to continue the conversation. Um, that's always fun. But anyway, to be irrational or illogical is to abandon what Scripture says about making or taking every thought captive to obey Christ. It says that in 2 Corinthians 10:5. And that means that it's also to be in sin if you are not thinking properly, if you're not submitting your thoughts to Christ, then we're in sin. We're thinking with a sinful mind. It could also be said that God's thoughts, or that we are thinking God's thoughts after Him, and that was coined by the astronomer and mathematician Johannes Kepler. He literally said, "I was merely thinking God's thoughts after Him," which expressed the idea that his scientific work was pointing to God's rational character and creation. Now, before I get into some of these informal fallacies, I want to quickly go over the laws of logic. I think having an understanding of these laws helps us understand, again, informal fallacies. Now, the three laws are, or the three fundamental laws are the law of identity, the law of non contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. Now, the law of identity says that a thing is what it says that it is. So, P is P, like the letter P. So, just using that to give the illustration. So, P is P and nothing else. For instance, if the statement "it is raining" is true, then it's true. It says that a thing is itself and not something else. The law of non contradiction states that something cannot be both true and not true at the same time. So saying something like "it is raining" is either true or it's false, but it can't be true that it is raining and also not raining at the same time and in the same relationship or circumstance. So I mentioned the same relationship or circumstance because it could be true that it's raining in Philadelphia, but not where I live in Delaware. So I couldn't say that it is raining over my house right now, and also that it is not raining over my house right now. Or another example is that I couldn't say my car is parked in the driveway and also that my car is not parked in the driveway. These are contradictory statements. The law of excluded middle says that a statement such as "it is raining" is either true or it is false. There is no in between or alternative, either P or non P. The light is on, the light is not on. It's either on or it's not on. There's no in between. Okay, so let's get into some common informal fallacies and some examples of these errors in thinking, because that's what a fallacy is. A logical fallacy is flawed logic or an error in thinking. Examples are great because you have probably heard a few of these and didn't realize that they were problematic. But it also helps us detect these things in the future if and when they occur. In my experience, two of the most common fallacies that I encounter personally are the straw man and the ad hominem. Ad hominem, sorry. Hominem. HOMINEM. Say it 3 times fast. A straw man is when someone constructs an argument that is a misrepresentation of what you believe and then they tear down that misrepresentation, giving the illusion that they just dismantled your position. So instead of fighting the man in front of them, they build a scarecrow or a straw man, and then they beat that up instead. They build a scarecrow or straw man, they beat it up because it doesn't fight back. It's easy to win when nothing is fighting back. Now, a great example of this particular fallacy is when somebody asks a Christian, and I know you've heard this, you had to have heard this, maybe not, but I hear it all the time. A great example of a straw man is when somebody asks a Christian, well, who created God? The problem is that this is a misrepresentation of the Christian worldview. No Christian believes that God was created. If there's a Christian who says that they believe that God was created, they are not a Christian. God is eternal and has always existed. He is the necessary precondition for the existence of all things. He was not made or created. I've also seen this when people have given the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. And just real quick, I'll go over that. The argument goes like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Premise 3, therefore, the universe had a cause. The skeptic might say, so you're saying everything needs a cause. That means that even God needs a cause. So who created God? But did you catch it? You have to really think about it. I hope you caught it. But the first premise is whatever begins to exist has a cause. God did not begin to exist. He always existed in all of eternity. God did not begin to exist. Therefore, God does not require a cause. Now, the second most popular fallacy I see almost every day, especially on the internet, and the majority of people are on the internet on Facebook or X or Instagram or TikTok, YouTube, whatever, and I guarantee you've seen it, and that is the ad hominem. This simply means ad hominem, it means to the man. This is when someone attacks a person instead of the argument that they're making. So, for instance, I was having a discussion with an atheist on Facebook, and he kept calling me a stupid freak. Now, I have an episode about that conversation. But anyway, he kept calling me personally a stupid freak. Whether or not I'm a stupid freak is neither here nor there. It had absolutely nothing to do with any of the arguments I was presenting. So it could be true that I'm a stupid freak, but it could also be true that the arguments I was making were good arguments and he wasn't addressing them at all. So calling me a stupid freak didn't address or answer any of the things that I was saying back to him. Again, another, it's fun talking. Another example might be when someone says to somebody who's maybe an abolitionist for abortion, like myself, they might say, you just don't care about women. Again, that has nothing to do with whether or not abortion is wrong. It could be true that a particular person doesn't care about women, but it doesn't say anything about the argument and whether or not abortion is wrong. It could be the case that the person doesn't care about women and that his arguments against abortion are valid, although that is hardly ever the case and just something that people start screaming because they no longer have anything of value to contribute to a conversation. That's typically when you will start to see these kinds of attacks. And ad hominem is usually a good indicator that you are presenting much better arguments. Calling you names is a defense mechanism against the other person's weak position. I might also add that the person who's arguing against abortion cares a lot more about women than the person who is arguing for abortion. They care much more about the little women that are in the uterus that nobody seems to care about. Um, but yeah, we're not doing an episode on abortion. I'm sure I will have many more of those. I have one already, and I will probably do more. But moving on, the fallacy of equivocation. Now, a lot of these fallacies just have big fancy words, but again, I'm explaining them, telling you what they mean. The fallacy of equivocation. This is when somebody makes an argument and changes the meaning of a word in the middle of the argument. We see this a lot when speaking to evolutionists. They often change the meaning of the word evolution mid sentence or mid conversation. The evolution, they can simply mean, or the word evolution can simply mean change, or it can mean that every life is descended from a common ancestor. There's two very different things, or those are two very different things. Both meanings are valid and legitimate, but they can't be conflated. Here's an example. They might say, creationists do not believe in evolution. Evolution happens. Things change every day. It's absurd for creationists to deny evolution. The middle sentence of this statement uses the word evolution in a different way than the first and third sentence. The first and third sentence are referring to evolution in terms of common descent, and the middle sentence is referring to change. A creationist can deny evolution in terms of common descent and still accept evolution in terms of change. There's no contradiction there. This is why we need to define terms. In this example, we could simply ask what is meant by evolution, change or common descent. And that's also why it's important to define terms. If you define terms, then you can avoid the equivocation fallacy. If you define terms and you say, "What do you mean by evolution?" And then they say, "Well, I mean common descent, like Darwinian evolution, monkey into man, fish to philosopher, whatever whatever they want to say." Then okay, that's the definition we're working on. So when you say evolution, that's what you mean. You don't simply just mean change, because again, those are two way different things. So we need to define terms. We need to be able to understand each other, what we're both talking about, because otherwise we're just going to talk past each other. We're not really going to have a productive conversation. So moving on to the next informal fallacy, let's talk about the fallacy of reification. This is when you treat an abstract concept as if it were real or physical. So an example would be something like saying, history will judge us. History is an abstract record of past events, not a conscious being that is going to judge or that can judge. This kind of thing is good for poetry or songwriting, but not for making sound logical arguments. Another would be, the science says evolution is true. Well, science doesn't actually say anything. Scientists with presuppositions do. Or here is a popular one that I can guarantee you've heard in the past, maybe even in the past few years. Follow the science. Science is a method or a systematic process of observation and experimentation. It's not a person or an authority that gives us instructions. If what you mean by this statement is that science itself is a conscious guide that leads, commands, or decides things, then that is the reification fallacy. It may not be a fallacy if someone means that we should base our decisions on the best available scientific evidence. Then it's just a figure of speech. So there's a distinction to be made. Science tells us what is, not what ought to be. Science itself doesn't actually tell us anything. Scientists do. So you have to kind of pay attention, because I think the reification fallacy can sometimes not so much be a fallacy if somebody's using it in again, just like as a figure of speech, or just more of like in a poetic way of some sort. But yeah, it's kind of attributing some kind of actual mind to a concept. Follow the science, or the science says, those types of things, and we hear it all the time. It's like, well, the science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. And when it came to the particular things that I'm talking about in the last couple of years, you know what I'm talking about. When it came to a certain illness, people would say, follow the science. Um, well, there's scientists on both sides that are saying different things. So which science are we following? But anyway, so moving on here's the next big word fallacy, right? We have the bifurcation fallacy. Is the one I mentioned in the beginning of the episode. And this is the fallacy, again, that I talk about in the episode about the Euthyphro Dilemma. If you didn't see or hear that episode, then shame on you. I'm just kidding. But yeah, go back and listen to it. It's, I think, helpful in being able to pick these things out. So this fallacy is committed when there are only two options given, when there could be a third option or explanation. For example, is last night the first time you beat your wife, or have you done that before? Of course, there is a third option. At least I hope there is for you. And that option is, I have never beat my wife. Is the traffic light red or green? There's another option. It could be yellow, at least for a few seconds. So this fallacy is also known as the false dilemma, or the either or fallacy. Yeah, it's when, only two options are given, when there is indeed a third option, and they've completely skipped over it and left you with no other way to answer the question. It's kind of a damning question, right? Was last night the first time you beat your wife, or have you done that before? Well, it's not really a way to answer that question without screwing yourself, right? Have you ever heard anyone claim that someone is guilty of circular reasoning? So that's the next one. Moving on. So that's another fallacy known as begging the question. And this is when the conclusion of one's statement is incorporated into one of its premises, or when the premise depends upon the conclusion. So an example would be, how do I know dinosaur fossils are millions of years old? Because it's a fact. So this is assuming that A, the dinosaur fossils are millions of years old, is true on the basis of B, that it's a fact. So the uh, the the second premise and conclusion are saying the same thing. This statement assumes that it assumes what it is trying to prove, is what I'm trying to say. I once heard someone say that we know that dinosaur fossils are millions of years old because they were found in sedimentary rock layers that are millions of years old. Well, how do you know that the sedimentary rock layers are millions of years old? Because they were found with dinosaur fossils that are millions of years old. Do you see how that's circular? Um, okay. So the dinosaur fossils are millions of years old because you found it in rock layers that are millions of years old, and you know that the rock layers are millions of years old because you found it with dinosaur fossils that are millions of years old. It's completely circular. Or another one, miracles are not possible because they cannot happen. So miracles are not possible because miracles are not possible. It's another example of circular reasoning. And then you have the fallacy of the complex question. This is the interrogative form of begging the question or circular reasoning. So a question is asked that assumes something that is unproved. So going back to a different form of a previous example, do you still beat your wife? A yes or no answer would be, again, it'd be damning to you. A yes would be damning for obvious reasons, but a no would assume that at some point you did beat your wife when that isn't the case. So this question should be broken up into two separate questions. The first question being, did you ever beat your wife? And then the second question would be, if so, do you continue to beat her? So you can see how that needs to be broken up, because if the answer to the first question, did you ever beat your wife, was no, well then you don't even need to ask the second question. So I'll give a few more informal fallacies and examples in hopes that this information is interesting or at least helpful to you, helpful to maybe have conversations. Here's one you may have maybe not have heard of, but have probably seen an example of. It's called the no true Scotsman fallacy. And this is when someone attempts to protect their claim by defining a term in a biased way. Um, so the example given for the origin of the fallacy goes like this. Person A says that no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. Person B tries to counter this by saying that his friend is a Scotchman and he puts sugar on his porridge. Then person A responds by saying, well, no true Scotsman puts sugar on their porridge. Or if an evolutionist says, all scientists accept Darwinian evolution. And you respond by saying, well, creation scientists and a lot of other Christian scientists don't accept Darwinian evolution. And then they respond by saying, well, all real scientists believe in Darwinian evolution. They define terms however they would like to define them to suit their worldview and their position, which means they can continuously do this to win a debate or an argument, but not if they're called out on their fallaciousness. So it's important to be able to spot it and detect it, because then you could say, okay, well, that's just an error in reasoning. Just because you want your position to sound stronger, you have redefined terms so that it seems that is the case. There's special pleading. And this is when someone applies a double standard. So someone might say, you shouldn't judge. Well, why are you judging me then? You shouldn't impose your morality on others. You can ask, is it your moral position that you shouldn't impose your morality on others? And if so, why are you imposing your morality on me? You have the genetic fallacy. And this is one that's also very popular. We've seen this over and over again on all sides of the political spectrum, especially in the last few years. It goes something like this. You can't believe anything that reporter says. She's from CNN. Or you can't trust anything that guy says. He's from Fox. Is it possible that a reporter from a news outlet that you hate does tell the truth, even if it's only from time to time? Another example that I have actually personally experienced quite a few times is something like this. You're only a Christian because you were born in America. Well, that might be true, but it says absolutely nothing about the validity or truth of Christianity. I could say you're only an atheist because your parents are atheists, or you only believe that baking soda and vinegar will fizz because you learned it in a chemistry class. Not to mention that Christianity didn't originate in America. Don't know if you didn't, or don't know if you knew that or not. Newsflash. It's not an American religion. So me being born in America is irrelevant. This fallacy offers no real argument against Christianity. Just as me saying you only believe that baking soda and vinegar will fizz because you learned it in chemistry class offers no argument against the truth of chemical reactions between baking soda and vinegar. Doesn't matter what you learned or where you learned it if it's true. The truth of something is not determined by where you learned it. So that is quite a few informal fallacies. I think there are so many more. There's a ton of them. I mean, there's a lot that I don't know, to be honest. I stick with the ones that are the most prevalent, the most popular, the ones that I personally come across most often. So those are the ones that I think you'll more than likely come across when having a conversation And from what I was looking up, a lot of these other fallacies are kind of based on these, having an understanding of these. But anyway, the I think having a decent understanding of the ones that I presented will definitely help your conversation. I think they will help you reshape the conversations that you're having with people. For example, I had a conversation with a couple Jehovah's Witnesses a couple days ago, and we were just kind of. It was actually a really good conversation, but we were just getting into some things. And I asked the one guy, I said, what was your background before coming to the Watchtower or the Jehovah's Witness faith, and what was it that brought you to it? And he started to kind of talk about the doctrine of hell because Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in hell, and he started saying things like, it really just didn't make sense to me. And I let him finish his point because I think it's important to listen. It's important to listen to people. But I went back to that and I said, you said it really didn't make sense to you. And when you say that, you're really just kind of telling me your psychological thought. You're really just kind of giving me like your state of mind behind it, but you're not really telling me anything that would say whether or not it's true or false. Just because it didn't make sense to you, does that mean that it isn't true? Because there's plenty of things that don't make sense to me. Calculus doesn't make any sense to me, but doesn't mean that calculus isn't a thing that people use. It doesn't, and not to mention that we're talking about an infinite God. We're talking about an infinite and perfect mind. The fallible, finite minds of men are not going to be able to 100% fully comprehend the mind of God. And I think that's okay. But that's just an example. I didn't like you don't need to go into a conversation and know all the names of the fallacies. You don't need to present it to people like that. Like you don't have to say, "Oh, well, hey, what you just said, that's the bifurcation fallacy," or what you just said is the reification fallacy. I mean, that's not going to oppress anybody. If anything, it's probably just going to make you look pompous or like a know-it-all. So it's not really so much important, or it's not as important anyway to know the terms, but I think it's more important to recognize the actual fallacy itself, the actual error in reasoning. That way you can address the error in reasoning, because it doesn't matter if you know what it's called or not. People aren't going to be impressed by that. They really don't care. But it's useful for conversation because you can point it out, like I did with the Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, well, I understand it didn't make sense to you, and that's fine, because a lot of things really don't make sense. But does that say anything to whether or not it's true or not? So I think that's maybe one way to, go about that or frame that. So anyway, I really hope this episode was helpful. I hope it was informative. I hope that you will be able to use this information. You might have to go back and listen a few times, or maybe pick up a book on logic. Dr. Jason Lyle has quite a few of them. And I'm sure there's many others out there, but I'm more familiar with his work. But pick up something and study it a little bit. I think it's really only gonna benefit you. You're gonna learn and be able to have better conversations with people. So anyway, if you enjoy this content and you've made it this far in this episode, leave a comment, subscribe, share this with your friends. Whatever it is, it's hard doing these things. It's hard getting the word out about the channel and the podcast and Instagram and TikTok. I mean, just all of these different things. So if you have friends that are interested in this, in apologetics or these kinds of topics, then share these episodes with them and get their thoughts, and hopefully it'll drive them to my channel, and more people will see and hear these things that I'm doing. So anyway, brothers and sisters, as always, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and always be ready to Give a reason for the hope that is in you with, reverence and gentleness, and always do it lovingly. And again, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time. All right. Thanks.